So let me introduce Holly, and she'll talk a little bit about the book, and then we'll have some commentary from some of the other speakers and some of the contributors who are joining us as well. Holly is needs no introduction. There we go. Okay, Holly, over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Yeah, it's fantastic to be back at an ASAA conference, because this project did begin in many ways at the last time we had one of these conferences in 2018, when we had a stream on stone veneration across Asia. And for the book project, we narrowed it down to mainland Southeast Asia. But from my perspective, the story of this book goes back even further. More than 20 years ago, when I was beginning my fieldwork for my PhD, I arrived on this island in the Mekong River, and the villagers had agreed to let me stay there. And very soon afterwards, I heard that a pig had been killed. And my Lao was very patchy back then, but I did know enough to gather that the death of this pig was something to do with the beginning of my residence in this village. So I asked if I could attend the ceremony, and people said yes, yes. And I was guided to this patch of forest. And this is not an island where there is a lot of forest. It's all rice fields and houses and gardens. But there was just this two tiny patches of forest in the middle of the village. And we went inside one of those, following a track to a clearing. And there was this very rough sort of shack in the middle of the clearing. And there was food being offered in what was obviously a shrine. There were candles, there was incense, and there was all the important men of the village, men in their middle ages and old age, all squashed in, offering something at this shrine. And I could see some carved things made of wood, some look like weapons, and a stone. And at the time, I thought that the stone was, like a piece of furniture, like to put the candles on or put the offerings on. And only later I realized that the stone was the center of what was being venerated in this ceremony. But at the time I was interested. So I said, well, can I come? Can I join in? And I sat in there with all these people, and I looked around, I realized I was the only woman. And looking back now, I don't know whether it was just because my Lao was so rudimentary or if people were just too polite to say anything. But I said, where are all the women? And they were like, oh, women aren't allowed in here. And so I quickly, shamefacedly climbed down and apologized, and everybody said, no, it's fine. It's like no big deal. And thus began my investigations into stone veneration in mainland Southeast Asia. And after that, of course, I just collected any mentions or references to stones as I was reading the literature of the region. And so this book owes a lot to the existing literature of the region. The book is very inspired by the work of Paul Moo, of course, but also Richard O'Connor, who's joining us today and will say a few words soon, and Penny Van Estrik, who wrote the afterword, and many other wonderful authors who have contributed to the literature of the region. So we really try to build on and synthesize what's already been written. And we also approach this because it's a huge topic and nobody can really approach it themselves. And the topic is stone veneration. We also approach it collaboratively, and that's why it's so important that this is an edited volume with people who have done studies from across the region coming together on a common question. So we tried, inspired again by Richard O'Connor and Penny Van Estrik, we tried to use this method of new ethnology, whereas the idea is to revive that kind of older style of ambitions with what we can do with the ethnographic record, not just endlessly talking about particular situations, but how can we build from that generalizations and even insights into human being. And as Louise Costa says in the forward to this book, often anthropologists rush a little bit and think, well, I've done my fine-grained ethnography. Now I want to do big A anthropology and answer some massive question about human being. But the new ethnology approach is to say, well, there's an in-between level where we can work in regions on general questions and see how can we build up from the very, very particular, whether they're historical case studies, ethnographic case studies, or in this book, sometimes both. How can we take those very particular examples and build up some general insights, not in a rush, but in a sort of a region-based level. So we've built on that kind of support of the collaborations and the existing literature. We've also been the beneficiaries of some wonderful material support. We had the support of the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre and the University of Sydney in supporting speakers to come to our panel, and also Chris Marcatelli to work on editing. And we also benefited from the wonderful NUS Press, Peter for his enthusiastic support, 2 anonymous reviewers who gave great suggestions, Lena Kwa, who pulled the book together at production stage, and Sana, who's here today, who's supporting it now that it's published. So a big thank you to everyone, including everybody who's come to this book launch today. I hope you enjoy reading the book, because we've certainly enjoyed writing it.
So much, Holly. And so now I'd like to invite one of our guests, Richard O'Connor, who's with us. Thank you very much, Richard, for joining us from so far. You are live and in video. So exactly. So I think we'll proceed to play the video, but Richard is here to answer questions and so on after the presentation. So cue video.
Thank you for inviting me to speak. It's an honor to celebrate Stone Masters. In a word, it's a feast. If you study materiality or the new animism, you'll savor this work. If you value research, not just in, but on Southeast Asia, this is your book. And if you study power, and it's hard to be taken seriously if you don't, you'll want to see how it plays out between territorial spirits on the one hand and social estate, municipal authorities, and village life on the other. So there's a lot here. I wish I had time to discuss the essays one by one, but there's 9 case studies, 11 contributors, 12 chapters, and I have just 15 minutes. So with apologies to the authors, I'll speak about the volume as a whole. Let's start with its common commitments and shared themes. 3 commitments drive the volume. The authors all agreed to look locally, to stress what people experience, and to avoid social science abstractions. Now, looking locally is standard fare for anthropology, and stressing people's experience isn't new. 60 years ago, in Cultural Continuities and Discontinuities in Southeast Asia, Loris and Sharp called for exactly that. But it's the third commitment, avoid abstractions, that breaks exciting new ground for me. Some of the essays don't just challenge the old answers, they blow them up with seriously new and good ideas. More on that later. On to the shared themes. There are 3. All the essays describe local spirits. All consider how these spirits interact with state, national, and local powers. And where apt, the essays factor in the region-wide fascination with stone. All 3 themes are in the title if you know how to translate it. Here, let me spare you my initial confusion. When I heard the title, Stone Masters, what came to mind was a master-apprentice distinction. But no, the book is not about master masons. Masters translates an indigenous way of talking respectfully about a territorial spirit, the lord of the place, an authority felt and found everywhere, from humble back alley spirit shrines to mountains ruling regions. Okay, so 3 themes, all conscientiously kept. Where does that take us? The short answer is this volume honors a 40-year tradition of themed collections. It is a fine addition to the interpretive wing of Southeast Asian studies. What tradition, you ask? Haven't heard of the interpretive wing? Well, this is a short answer. Bear with me for the long one. Let me start with the big picture. Perhaps you know Jim Scott's book, The Art of Not Being Governed. kind of hard not to. It's got over 5,800 citations. That's the political economy wing of Southeast Asian studies. Other than Scott, think Harry Benda, Ben Anderson. It's no accident that all three got their doctorates in government or political science, and not surprisingly, their work revolves around the big stuff: states, nations, political conflict. Nearly 6,000 citations. 3 cheers for Jim. He deserves them because he brings Southeast Asia to life, not just this people or that place, but the region. Right? Sadly, my branch of Southeast Asian studies, the interpretive wing, does the opposite. Indeed, it now doubts there is a region at all. That skepticism took a couple decades to mature, but by the 1980s, this school had talked itself out of Southeast Asia as anything but a Western cultural construction, or to be exact, it had talked itself into a localism so deep and complete that every place and practice and people became so unique that shared regional realities disappeared. That was and is well-intended, but I believe localism rests on a methodological mistake. It supposes the region is made up of independent cultures, which we can study conveniently one by one. Well, good luck finding those boundaries, and watch out for supposing what Sharp satirized as cookie cutter cultures. In fact, again and again, scholars find the region's cultures interact here, overlap there, and share a metaculture pretty much everywhere. Now, be that as it may, and however well-intended, localism has had an unfortunate unintended consequence. It undermines Southeast Asia. It's not, for Southeast Asian studies, I mean, it's not much of a field if there's nothing there to study. How can the interpretive wing pull the rug out from under itself? How indeed has Southeast Asian studies survived themed volumes like Stone Masters? That's our tradition. Topical collections. Chapter by chapter, such local cases can blossom in their uniqueness, while some larger regional reality, the volume's theme, right, gets examined in various lights. Here, perhaps aided by a synthetic essay or two, readers are left to draw any regional conclusions they choose. It's the neoliberal approach to area studies. Now, I don't dismiss this tradition. I can't. It's half of my CV. It does, however, call for some reflection. We know these volumes advance careers. Do they advance knowledge? Take gender. In that 1962 talk by Sharp, he noted the high status of Southeast Asian women compared to China and India. That was a bold beginning. How has it fared? In Steedley's 1999 annual review article, she notes 5 collections on gender had been published, but still no consensus on Sharp's observation. Why? To quote, anthropologists have shifted increasingly to smaller units of generalization or refuse to generalize at all. So gender in Southeast Asia dissolves into, quoting again, its internal complexity, historical specificity, and the variety of motives and positions of social actors and observers. Try to build on that. It's pretty iffy on multiple grounds. Well, now jump ahead to 2006. To write her history of Southeast Asian women, The Flaming Womb, Barbara Ann Daya had to generalize. Anthropologists were no help, just the opposite. In her words, they were foremost among those reluctant to assert a regional pattern. Why? Gender, in their very highly local way, was subject to consistent negotiation in specific environments. That's hardcore localism. It's uncompromising. Now, I trust the experts, so I don't doubt it's true. But I would ask 2 further questions. Is it the whole truth? A thoughtful answer, at least for me, would require comparative regional study, but that's rarely done. And doing that further research would help answer my second question. Have you done what you can to advance knowledge? On its own, localism doesn't address these questions. Happily, Stone Masters, essay by essay, they do. Well, now, given how insular localism can be, we need themed volumes like Stone Masters if Southeast Asia and studies is to prosper, perhaps even survive, right? Commercial publishers aren't up to that. So we need to thank the National University of Singapore Press for bringing out this collection. And while we're at it, let's applaud the many university presses and area programs that have long supported such themed volumes. Well, Jim Scott doesn't need their support, at least not now. Right? Look at his bibliography. He depends heavily on scholarship that require support, such as NUS Press has given Stone Masters. He cites several of my publications, and I can say everyone got into print only thanks to area programs and university presses. Okay, back to our earlier question. Do these themed volumes advance knowledge? I trust most do, but let me ask a harder question. Do new volumes build on prior ones or just go back to square one? Building is hard. Starting over is easy. What we saw with gender was discouraging, at least to me. What I see with Stone Masters makes me optimistic. The authors do the hard work of grappling with earlier studies. Paul Moose's classic on indigenous cults is deeply and repeatedly engaged, and the Tannenbaum and Kammerer volume on founders' cults gets cited copiously. Good work. Another reason to be positive is that the essays speak to each other, so the whole has a strength no part can have on its own. That's a credit to the authors and Holly High's editorial hand. Now, in opening, I said avoiding old abstractions broke exciting new ground. Well, let me tell you about one breakthrough. This is my favorite. It appears in many essays, but it is most fully developed in Courtney Work's article. I see it as two moves. The first is kind of this imaginative leap, radically widening what we consider society. It's not just we humans that relate to each other. It's how all animate beings are in this thing we call life together. Right? The second move is analytical. Within this vastly wider world, what motivates the way humans play their part? The answer, building good relationships with all other beings. It sounds kind of obvious, right? Well, it wasn't and isn't in the social sciences. The spirits have never been so free. Just ask Malinowski, Durkheim, Geertz, Foucault. They cast spirits in dramas of functionalism, social, societal order, webs of meaning, discourses of power. Stone Masters challenges all of that. What a breath of fresh air. Are the spirits now free to be themselves? The book doesn't settle on an answer. As for me, if it's not the ghost of Durkheim speaking, I don't see how to separate building relationships with spirits from humankind's elder-junior exchange, a basic societal building block. And how easily can we separate those exchanges from the patron-client entourages Hanks describes and the men of prowess Walter sees? Now, to finish, let me tie up two loose ends. Remember Jim Scott's book. Its full title is The Art of Not Being Governed, an Anarchist History of Upland Southeast Asia. What I learned from Stone Masters suggests we need a companion volume that recognizes how animism works, something like The Art of Governing Ourselves and Negotiating Power, the new animist guide to contemporary Southeast Asia. Well, that's one loose end. The other is Loris and Sharp's 1962 article, Cultural Continuities and Discontinuities in Southeast Asia. Why do I keep mentioning it? Well, we have to go back that far to find a comprehensive view of Southeast Asia that takes experience and materiality as seriously as Stone Masters does. At the time, Sharp's article was state of the art. It was a presidential address to the Association of Asian Studies. It made regional sense out of a vast swath of Asia and innumerable sources. And Sharp was a founder of the Cornell Southeast Asia program. The article looked cutting edge circa 1962, but it would prove a dead letter. Over the next 20 years, it got only 6 citations. What happened? The epistemic shift that led to localism. From the 1960s onward, culture as meaning and immersive fieldwork paired up to find the independent cultures each already supposed were out there in the real world. Soon, cultural diversity became the region's defining feature, and eventually, some felt there was no region at all. Reflecting back on a lot of good came out of localism. So I'm a participant, and not I was part of that. Thanks to its many ethnographies, if you go group by group, we now know vastly more about the peoples living in Southeast Asia. But flip that around. How does Southeast Asia live in its peoples? Put that way, we know little, if any, more than when Sharp gave his talk. That's why we need books like Stone Masters, collections that ask regional questions and break with the old answers. So thank you for indulging me. This is a fine book, and I very much appreciate being able to talk to this audience.
Thank you very much for those remarks. So we'll now enter where we have 4 contributors with us, some in the room and some online. And such a fraught and nervous making process it is. But we'll ask the 4 contributors to speak for about 5 minutes. And then Richard, I know it's late where you are, I guess. If you can stick with us, we can do the questions, if there are any questions after we have the contributions from the other speakers. I hope that's not too much of an imposition on your evening. So who would be the first speaker to
study of this mountain located in the northern of Vietnam. When the mountain was referred to as the Đột Ngột Cao Sơn in Vietnamese, or so-called the high peak king, in all the temples surrounding, in the villages surrounding this mountain. So the mountain was worshipped as the king. But to the majority of the Vietnamese population, the mountain was known as a site to worship the Hung Kings, which is considered, and every year there's a big kind of commemoration ceremony contribute to at this site as a way of worshiping the national ancestor. So how come the high peak king become the national ancestor? In my chapter, I unpack different layers of in the history from the very early on, 800 years ago, when the Vietnamese feudal stage tried to top up the mountain story with the story of the national king of the Viet Kingdom, and then build up this site as a site to talk about how the Viet population was the children of the dragon and the bird. And then came later on in the 19th century, where the French educated scholars, Vietnamese scholars, try to use the idea of nationhood and nationalist concepts into the story of the king, binding the kingship with the idea of nationhood. And the modern state, the socialist state, also see it as a fruitful opportunity to to combine the idea of the Hung Kings, the Hung Mountain, the worship to ancestor with the ideology of the late socialist national identity. So throughout, it appeared that the state played a driving role in development and promotion of the Hung Temple as a national resource. However, in these enduring power and encounters, the Hung King themselves have shown agency and power. From the humble start through several texts in as a mountain name, the symbol has become a fruitful bite for nationalist consumer in the colonial and then in the modern state time. The Hung King as a stakeholder in a power encounter have influenced the way the interaction would be and influence the outcome as much as the will of the people in the present time. So Hung King has become a spiritual agent with power, affecting the nations and people's life. Throughout the chapter, I've shown how stone reveals frequently as the mountain, as the stone being built in the temple, the stone being brought into the temple to be the worship objects, and also stone being ignored and forgotten. Looking again the whole story from stone perspective, the vital power of materials present through multiple layers of meaning makings and story constructing, the stone stay the core elements of secrets tied with the presence of place and the power of place perceived by its inhabitants, whether it's an individual, village, or nation. Putting stone at the center of my analysis, one thing I find interesting the most is that it unpacks the surface visions and reveal the significant point that allow me to join the discussion of the whole book about new animism and argue the possibility of a symbiotic parasitism relationship between the growing power of stone master and the power of the contemporary nation state. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Our next contributor is David, and we're going to try the video again.
All right, so my name's Paul David Lutz. I'm a recent PhD graduate at the University of Sydney's Department of Anthropology and author of Chapter 5 of Stone Masters, entitled The Party State Has Come, Ritual Rupture and Cosmological Continuity on a Ridgetop in Laos. I won't summarize my chapter here, beyond noting that it discusses a series of power encounters involving the ethnic Kumuan Aka village I call Sanjing in Pongsali province, far north Laos, a local spirit lord who resides, or resided, I should say, in a once tabooed nearby hilltop, the modernizing nation state, and increasingly Chinese power, and in particular, Chinese hydropower. I'll leave it there, and note also that in a sense, my chapter in Stone Masters summarizes the framing story of my PhD thesis, and thus of the book I hope to have ready sometime in 2023. So if you will, you could treat my chapter as a teaser, and if you like it, do stay tuned for the book. For the purposes of this launch, Holly has asked me and other contributors to share something that we learned by putting stone at the center of our analysis. And I want to do so by referring to one stone that I mentioned in the chapter, and which you see here on your slide, a pear-shaped stone stela located on the ridgetop not far from Sanjing, not far from the village, where I did and do indeed my research. So firstly, I should note that I did not start my ethnographic research with stones or spirits at the center of my analysis. As some of you might know, I came to my PhD on the back of several years in the development industry. And an interest in stones or stone-like landscape features and their attendant spirits or occult forces is something that grew from my fieldwork. And it was indeed an agenda that my interlocutors, the people of Sanjing, set for me. And they did so not least with regards to this stela. So originally, a few weeks into my fieldwork, I was shown this stela in the context of a border dispute between Sanjing and a neighboring village. So Sanjing's village chief had taken me there and claimed that it was once the border marker between these two villages who were now disputing the border between them. According to other villagers, however, the stela was once used for propitiating local territorial spirits. So villagers would offer a pig or a goat and other things to or at this stone and call on their local spirit lord to ensure their safety, well-being, and ideally prosperity in this area. According to others still, this stone stela marked the site of a different ritual aimed not at local spirits, but at reaffirming Sanjing's allegiance to the kingdom of Luang Prabang. So this is an area historically on the northern fringes of the Lao kingdom of Luang Prabang. Yet others still claimed the stone marks the grave of a merchant caravan leader. You will also note that there's an inscription on the stone, which neither locals nor I, nor the many scholars both within Laos and internationally that I've asked have been able to decipher. And I detail all of this, the various stories surrounding this stela, more in my upcoming book than in the Stonemaster's chapter. But what I want to note here is that local people told me several different and at times conflicting things about this stela, and I never found out which one is true. And to this day, I don't know what really happened at and with this stela. And it's precisely here that the stone taught me something. So in her other book, her other recent book, Project Land, Holly noted that ethnography can work as much through failure as through success. And in hindsight, I see my failure to find out what really happened at and with this stone as such a success, because it taught me how to approach history as an anthropologist. So initially, I wanted to know what really happened at this stone. I was seeking factual historical truth, if you will. But as I discovered, that desire was not shared by my interlocutors. Their various stories, and I gave you a few snippets a minute ago, about the stone's past was fundamentally motivated by present agendas and contemporary pursuits. So for example, wanting the stone to be a border marker in the context of an ongoing border dispute. Again, I can't go into details, but yeah, noting that what the stone taught me is, as it were, that my job as an anthropologist is less to find out what really happened than to find out how and why the past is remembered or indeed forgotten today. To be sure, I still want to know what the true history is of this stone stela, but now consider my immediate ethnographic task, if you will, as finding out what locals' conflicting claims about the stone's past can tell us about Sanjing's future-oriented present. And it's this approach, this anthropological approach to history, if you will, that I have since applied more broadly to my work. So traversing, if you will, this gray zone between ethnographic history and an ethnography of history, what the past means in this culturally specific context. And it's certainly an approach that I applied to the Tales of Power encounter I recount in my Stonemaster's chapter, and again, will do more broadly in my forthcoming book. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Let me then give the microphone to Holly to talk about her contribution.
Great, thank you. So I wrote 3 chapters for this book, the introduction, and a chapter called Living with New Gods, and another one called Lady Luck of the City. So in these chapters together, I explore many of the examples of stone cults that I've seen in my years of research in Lao PDR. Okay, so the one example I talk about is after my first field work, I went up to do field work in Sekong province with the ethnic Gatdu village. And in that village, people spoke about a golden stone stingray that lived in a pond in a patch of forest that was just off to the side of the village. No one I knew had ever seen this stone, but it powerfully shaped these people's experiences of coming to live in this place, which was not their local territories. They had been resettled. And part of the dynamics of that resettlement was coming to live with this new power, the ahak, which they experience very much as an oppressive kind of power. So that's the picture on the bottom left. In the middle is a picture of Me Nang Si Muang, who is the goddess of the city pillar of Vientiane. So in this chapter, I analysed the myths that are told about this character. So the shortest version is that she is a pregnant lady who, when the city pillar was being erected, volunteered to throw herself into the pit where the pillar was erected. So, and that act transformed her from an ordinary person into a regal figure. She's called the Jiao Muang, like the lord or lady of the city. The picture on the far right is the city pillar of Sekong province, and this was erected in 2011. This pillar was designed by the local government explicitly to be symbolic of the area, and it incorporates symbolism drawn from ethnic minorities along with Buddhist imagery. So this pillar is supposed to look like a buffalo sacrifice stake, but it also has like Buddhist inspirations as well. The Sekong city pillar felt very dead. Like this is not, even though people said that it's meant to be inhabited by the spirits of past political leaders of Sekong, it really didn't feel lively. Like this had not caught on in popular imagination like these other two stone cults that I've given examples of. So reflecting on these three different cases, I want to say today that one interesting thing that I think I've learned from my analysis of by putting stones at the center is that these cults are usually about power. But typically, these are usually encounters between different contenders for power. So thinking about Nang Me Simuang, Lady Luck of the city, her pregnant body can represent the fertility of life that we all have as living creatures. And the stone pillar over her body can represent power over life in things like military, the state, and religion. If the Sekong pillar represents Salau PDR's avid attempt to set in concrete its power over this remote area, the lackluster uptake of this potential stone cult contrasts with the persistence, the very strong persistence of other forms of ritual, such as real live buffalo sacrifices, which are really colourful and really exciting compared to this grey slab. And if this golden stone stingray is the guardian of the land, then this contrasts with the new settlers' assertion that they are now the new owners of the land, and ultimately their assertion that they can be owners of themselves. So that's me.
Thank you very much, Holly. And now it's the turn of Professor Kazuo Fukuura, who is joining us live on Zoom. Professor Fukuura, thank you very much for your patience. You're on.
You're welcome. Maybe a few minute version would be better because the time is. Maybe scholars who are working in Australia knows much about the history of Northern Thai studies made by Australian School of Thought, beginning from such names as Richard Davis or Graham Widgery, and I will briefly explain. This is actually the city pillar, left side of Chiang Mai, center of northern region in Thailand. And why the stone is important in this case? Because in various chronicles, the pillar had been described as trees, a stone, and 3 stone, something like that, a brick wall. And actually, the ongoing one is a brick wall, octagonal one. And this worship has played a major role in the development of primordial religion in Chiang Mai for centuries. And the belief had been the major source of historical suzerain power. And it was collapsed due to the national integration of the region into Siam. So today's city pillar worship has become one of the most important cultural capital of the local people. And then what did I learn by putting the stone at the center of my analysis? First, by putting the stone at the center of my analysis, I've noticed that actually the spirit worship was extracted from the pillar at the mid-20th century and represented in the last ritual tray, lifestyle picture, as another materiality. And such a procedure must have contributed to avoiding the then possible religio-cultural encounter between the former suzerain side and the national power, as well as conserving the belief in the pillar spirit. And secondly, in the future, it is certain that the spirit of the pillar and its spirit will persist among local people, and that the pillar's territorial power will remain highly relevant to those who vie for authority in that region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Fukura. Okay. Thank you very much for attending this hybrid session. If you're online, you can get the book from the NUS Press website using the discount code ASAA25. ASAA25. If you're here in Melbourne, our table is near the feels like the northern entrance to the building, or just come find us. And so thank you again. Congratulations, Holly. Here's the book. Thanks.